On a Tuesday morning in the heart of June, with the air already thick and humming with the promise of summer heat, a final galvanized steel post was driven into the rich, dark earth of the valley. Richard Sterling, project manager for the AgriCorp Northern Plains Division, watched the hydraulic post driver hiss and retract. His arms crossed over the clean, crisp logo on his polo shirt. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The fence was complete. It ran for 3.5 miles, a ruler straight line of woven wire and steel that demarcated the new corporate boundary with brutal geometric precision. That line, so perfect on his survey maps and so gleamingly absolute in the morning sun, cut directly across a gravel driveway that had, for 74 years, connected the Blackwood family farm to the county road. For Richard Sterling, this was merely the tying of a loose end, the final step in securing a multi-million-dollar acquisition. For Silas Blackwood, standing on his porch a quarter-mile away, it was the closing of a gate on his entire world. Let me tell you about Richard Sterling. He was a man forged in the crucible of modern business, a product of quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. He was 42 years old, with a sharp suit for every occasion and a belief, held with near religious fervor, that any problem could be solved with sufficient capital and the correct application of modern technology. He had an MBA from a prestigious school and had climbed the corporate ladder at AgriCorp with a speed that left his peers breathless and resentful. He saw the world not as a landscape of hills, creeks, and old family holdings, but as a grid of assets and liabilities. The patchwork of small farms in this valley was, to him, an inefficiency, a relic of a bygone era. AgriCorp's mission, as he saw it, was to consolidate these inefficiencies into a single streamlined, profitable agricultural machine. He'd spent the last year negotiating, cajoling, and, when necessary, strong-arming the local landowners. He bought out the Miller Place, the Jansen Farm, and finally the sprawling acreage of the old Weatherby estate, which bordered Silas Blackwood on 3 sides. Sterling's team used GPS-guided tractors that could plan a field to within a centimeter of a digital plan, and drones that monitored crop health with infrared cameras. His world was one of data, of optimization, of relentless forward progress. The gravel road that cut across the corner of the former Weatherby property was a tiny, insignificant detail on a survey map, a historical anomaly that had no place in his clean, efficient future. The technology that erected the fence was a marvel of its own. It was not the work of a few men with shovels and a tamping bar. A massive, articulated truck, itself costing more than Silas's entire farm was likely worth, had rolled onto the property. It carried a carousel of steel posts and a 1,000-pound hydraulic hammer. Guided by a laser sighting system linked to a GPS coordinate, the machine drove a post every 10 seconds, perfectly plumb and at the exact specified depth. Another vehicle followed, unreeling the heavy gauge wire, while a mechanized tensioner pulled it taut with thousands of pounds of force, humming like a giant metallic insect. Sterling had watched the process with pride. His crew had fenced over 3 miles in 2 days. It was a testament to modern industrial power. It was efficient. It was final. He had sent the legally required notices to Silas Blackwood, of course. Certified mail. His legal department had assured him that the old easement for the road was informal, unrecorded, and therefore legally void upon the sale of the property. It was a clean case. To Sterling, Silas Blackwood was just another variable that had been successfully managed. The first sign of trouble, from Silas's perspective, was not the arrival of the fencing crew, but the silence that preceded it. For weeks he'd heard the familiar sound of his neighbors' tractors, the distant lowing of their cattle. Then, one by one, they had gone quiet. The moving vans had come and gone. The for sale signs had been replaced by stark corporate no trespassing placards. He had lived on this land his entire life, 78 years of it. He had been born in the front bedroom of the house his grandfather built. The gravel road was more than just an access route. It was a memory lane. He remembered riding his bicycle down it as a boy, his father driving the old farm truck up it, the tires crunching a familiar rhythm. He remembered bringing his own wife home along that road, and later teaching his son to drive on its gentle curves. The notion that it could simply be erased was as foreign to him as the language of corporate law. When the certified letter arrived, he'd read it with a slow, mounting sense of disbelief. He had called the number provided. A polite but firm young woman in an office hundreds of miles away had informed him that the matter was not open for discussion. Now, the stalemate. Silas stood on his porch, the letter crumpled in his work-worn hand, and looked at the glinting new fence. It was like a dam had been built, and his farm was the suddenly stagnant water behind it. His property was now effectively landlocked. To the north and east was the impassable Bear Creek Ravine, a deep gash in the earth with sheer rock walls. To the west, the dense, old-growth timber of the State Forest Preserve, where no vehicle could pass. The only way in or out had been that gravel road, which now terminated abruptly in a wall of steel and wire. His pickup truck, his only means of getting to town for supplies, for groceries, for a doctor's visit, sat uselessly in its shed. The isolation was sudden and total. It was a quiet, bureaucratic siege. Let me tell you about Silas Blackwood. He was a man who moved with the deliberate pace of the seasons. His hands, thick and calloused, were maps of a life spent in labor, each scar a story of a broken bolt or a slipped wrench. He was a watcher. He'd watched the sky for rain, the corn for signs of blight, and the markets for a fair price. He'd watched generations of families come and go in the valley, and for the past 6 months, he had watched AgriCorp arrive. He watched their surveyors drive stakes with fluorescent pink ribbons, their soil testing crews drill cores from the earth, and their executives in shiny cars drive slowly past his property, their faces impassive behind tinted windows. He was not a man given to panic. His father, a man who had survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, had taught him that panic was a useless, expensive energy. "There's always a way," his father used to say. "You just have to be quiet enough to see it." Silas's first attempts to solve the problem were the modern ones. He did what any citizen in his position would do. He called his lawyer in town, a man named Bill Peterson, whose father had been Silas's father's lawyer. Bill listened patiently, his voice full of sympathy, but the news was grim. "Silas, they're technically in the right," Bill had explained, the sound of rustling papers faint over the phone line. "Your father and old man Weatherby had a handshake agreement. It was honored for decades, but it was never filed with the county, never recorded on the deed. When AgriCorp bought the Weatherby land, they bought it free and clear of any unrecorded encumbrances. Their title search was perfect. Legally, your road doesn't exist." The words hung in the air. It doesn't exist. A road he had driven on thousands of times. His next attempt was the County Board of Supervisors. He put on his good Sunday shirt, drove into town with a neighbor who came the long way around, and stood before the 3-person board in the stuffy, wood-paneled meeting room. He spoke plainly and without anger, explaining his situation. The supervisors, men he had known for most of his life, looked uncomfortable. The chairman, a man named Henderson who ran the local hardware store, cleared his throat. "Silas, we understand your position," he said, avoiding eye contact. "But AgriCorp is a significant new partner for this county. They're promising 60 new jobs, a substantial increase to our tax base. Their legal team has presented us with their plans, and everything is in order. Our hands are tied." It was a dead end. The quiet power of influence and money had spoken more loudly than 74 years of history. The system, the modern system of laws and regulations he had trusted, had failed him completely. He was trapped by the very efficiency he saw on display. Defeated, Silas returned home. For several days, he fell into a quiet despair. He would walk the perimeter of his property, his old dog trailing faithfully behind him, his eyes always coming back to the impassable fence. He felt like a ghost on his own land. It was during one of these walks, as he stood at the far southern edge of his property, a place he hadn't had reason to visit in years, that something stirred in his memory. This part of the farm was a tangle of overgrown brush, sumac, and young poplar trees. It sloped down into a marshy bottomland before rising again to meet the old forgotten Southridge Road, a little-used county maintenance track. The area was a mess, choked with fallen trees from a storm a decade ago and dotted with massive moss-covered boulders. No modern vehicle could ever hope to pass through it, but as he stood there, squinting against the sun, a ghost of a memory surfaced. It was the echo of a sound, the rhythmic clanking tread, and the deep, throaty chug of a diesel engine. It was the memory of his father, a younger man in dusty overalls, working in this very spot. He retreated not to his house, but to the old barn. The main part of the barn was still in use, housing his small tractor and haying equipment. But the back section, the part his father had built with hand-hewn timbers, was a museum of the past. It was dark and cool, smelling of dust, old oil, and time itself. Sunlight streamed in through cracks in the siding, illuminating dancing dust motes. And there, in the deepest shadows, under a canvas tarp heavy with the dust of 30 years, sat the solution. It wasn't a plan or a legal strategy. It was a machine. Let me tell you about the Caterpillar 22. She was born in a factory in Peoria, Illinois, in 1934, a year of dust storms and desperation. She was not built for speed or for comfort. She was built for one purpose: to pull. Her engine was a low-compression gasoline motor that could be started by hand crank, a 4-cylinder beast that produced a mere 25 horsepower at the drawbar. But that number was a lie. It wasn't about horsepower, it was about torque. The engine turned at a lazy 1,100 revolutions per minute, and through a series of massive hardened steel gears, it delivered a relentless, uncompromising twisting force to the two steel tracks. Her frame was not welded, but riveted together from thick plates of American steel. There were no computers, no hydraulics, no delicate electronics. Every control was a direct mechanical linkage, a lever for a clutch, a pedal for a brake. Silas's father had bought her used in 1948, after the war. He'd paid for her with 2 years' worth of crop profits, a staggering investment at the time, and she had paid him back 1,000 times over. She had cleared the very fields that now lay fallow. She had pulled the stumps of ancient oaks, dragged boulders from the soil, and graded the original path for the very road that was now blocked. She was a family heirloom, a mechanical pack mule that had built their lives. She was called the Old Girl. A few days later, Richard Sterling was making a final inspection of the new AgriCorp property, his clean, white pickup truck kicking up dust on the service road that ran parallel to the new fence. He saw a flicker of movement near the Blackwood property line and slowed down, curious. He saw the old man, Silas, standing at the edge of the overgrown thicket, staring into it. Sterling felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Pity, perhaps, or maybe just annoyance at the untidiness of the situation. He pulled over and got out, the electronic door lock chirping behind him. "Mr. Blackwood," Sterling called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Everything all right over there?" Silas turned slowly. He nodded, his face unreadable. "Just looking." Sterling walked closer to the fence, his expensive work boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. He gestured with his chin toward the impenetrable wall of vegetation. "Not much to see. My survey team said this whole section is a washout, marshy, full of rock, completely impassable." He said the word impassable with a finality that brooked no argument, the same finality with which he ran his business. Silas's gaze drifted from Sterling to the thicket and back again. "My father used to have a track through here," he said, his voice quiet. "Went down through the bottom and up to the South Ridge Road. Used it in the spring when the main road washed out." Sterling almost laughed. He looked at the 78-year-old man, at the wild, untamed wilderness before them, and the idea struck him as utterly absurd. "A track? Sir, with all due respect, my geological surveyors used ground-penetrating radar on this section. It's a swamp. You'd need a $500,000 amphibious excavator and a team of engineers just to clear a path. You think some old forgotten track is going to do what my state-of-the-art equipment couldn't even map properly?" The mockery was plain in his voice, a casual, dismissive arrogance that was as natural to him as breathing. His crew, working 100 yards away, had stopped to watch, and a few of them snickered. Silas didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Sterling, his pale blue eyes as calm as a winter sky. "Your machines are built for speed," he said. "They're light and fast. They're meant to skim over the top of things. Some things you can't skim over. Some things you have to go through slow." He then turned and walked back toward his barn, leaving Sterling standing by the fence, shaking his head at the old man's foolishness. It wasn't a wager in the traditional sense. With money on the line, the stakes were higher than that. It was a wager between two worlds, between two philosophies. Sterling, out of options and with nothing to lose but a little time, had unknowingly agreed to watch. He was convinced he was about to witness the pathetic final efforts of a man who refused to accept the inevitable. The next morning, a new sound echoed across the valley. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a modern diesel engine or the beep of a reversing truck. It was a sound from another time, a rhythmic metallic clank followed by a series of sharp pops and then a deep chugging roar that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Richard Sterling, in his temporary on-site office, heard it and stepped outside. His whole crew stopped what they were doing and stared toward the Blackwood farm. From the dark maw of the old barn, a machine emerged into the sunlight. It was small, smaller than any of their modern bulldozers, and painted a faded, flaking yellow. It moved slowly, ponderously, on two narrow steel tracks, each metal plate clanking against the next. It was the Caterpillar 22. The old girl had woken up. The arrival of the machine was an event. It was like watching a dinosaur walk out of a museum. It looked ancient, primitive. The AgriCorp crew, young men accustomed to air-conditioned cabs and joystick controls, started laughing and pointing. "Look at that thing!" one of them yelled. "It belongs in a scrapyard." Sterling folded his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. This was going to be even more entertaining than he'd thought. But then they watched what Silas did next, and the laughter began to die down. He didn't just charge into the brush. For the entire first day, he undertook a slow, meticulous setup. He walked the entire length of the proposed path, a distance of nearly a mile, with a hand axe and a ball of twine. He tied small pieces of red cloth to trees he needed to remove, and white cloth to mark the locations of hidden rocks he remembered from his boyhood. He wasn't imposing a straight line on the land. He was finding a path that was already there, a path of least resistance that his father had discovered 80 years prior. He then spent the rest of the day with the Caterpillar, not working, but preparing. He checked the oil, a thick, dark fluid he wiped on a rag. He greased dozens of fittings with a hand-pumped grease gun, methodically forcing out the old, dried grease and replacing it with fresh. He tensioned the tracks using a massive wrench that looked like it weighed 50 pounds. It was a ritual, a slow communion between man and machine. Sterling's crew would have done a computerized diagnostic in 5 minutes. Silas took 5 hours. The real work began on the second day. Silas drove the 22 to the edge of the thicket. Behind it, he dragged an ancient piece of equipment, a heavy-duty single-shank ripper that looked like a giant steel claw. The engine chugged, black smoke puffing from the short, straight exhaust pipe. He lowered the claw into the earth, throttled up, and engaged the clutch. The moment of truth. The little tractor's engine note deepened from a chug to a deep, resonant growl. The steel tracks, designed with raised grousers for maximum grip, dug into the soil. The whole machine seemed to hunker down, to grab the planet itself for leverage. And then, slowly, inexorably, it began to move forward. The ripper tore through the dense network of roots and clay, pulling up rocks the size of watermelons. It wasn't fast. It was agonizingly slow, a few feet a minute, but it did not stop. Sterling and his crew watched, their amusement turning to a grudging curiosity. They saw Silas work with a kind of patient, relentless skill they had never witnessed. He would pull a massive, half-rotted log from the mud, a log that would have stalled one of their skid steers, and the 22 would just keep pulling, the tracks churning, the engine never faltering. When he hit a large boulder, he didn't try to force it. He would stop, get off the machine, and spend an hour digging around it with a shovel and a pry bar, finding the exact point of leverage. Then he would wrap a heavy chain around it, hook it to the tractor's drawbar, and pull it from the earth with that same slow, irresistible force. He was demonstrating a deep, practical understanding of physics that no computer program could replicate. He was using the machine not as a weapon against the land, but as a tool to persuade it. The climax of the action was not a single dramatic pull, but a week of them. Every morning at sunrise, Silas would start the old engine, and its chugging would be the new heartbeat of the valley. Every evening at sunset, he would shut it down. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the path began to emerge from the wilderness. It wasn't a straight, ugly gash like a modern road would be. It was a winding, organic path that followed the contours of the land. It skirted the marshiest spots, weaved between the largest of the ancient trees, and found the natural shelf of rock that provided a solid base through the wet bottomland. Sterling found himself drawn to the fence line every day, watching. He stopped seeing a rusty old relic. He started seeing a marvel of engineering. The 22 had no fancy features, but that was its greatest strength. It had no computer to tell the engine it was overloaded. It had no safety override to cut the power. It would simply do what the operator commanded, or it would break in the attempt. And it was built in an era when things were not designed to break. On the seventh day, the final obstacle was cleared. The path, rough but solid, now connected Silas's farm to the South Ridge Road. The last pull was a large poplar tree that had fallen across the final stretch. Silas chained it up, and the 22 dragged it aside as easily as if it were a child's toy. He then drove the little tractor back and forth, dragging a simple steel blade to level the worst of the ruts. Finally, it was done. He drove the caterpillar back to the barn, its job finished. A profound silence fell over the valley, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Then Silas did something that stunned the onlookers. He walked to his shed, got into his old blue pickup truck, started the engine, and drove. He drove slowly and carefully down the new raw earth of the path he had carved. The truck bounced and jostled, but it moved steadily forward. It disappeared into the trees, and a few minutes later, the AgriCorp crew heard its engine on the South Ridge Road. He was out. He was free. A spontaneous cheer erupted from Sterling's crew. It wasn't a cheer against their boss. It was a cheer for the impossible thing they had just witnessed. It was a cheer for the old man and his ancient machine. Richard Sterling did not cheer. He stood in stunned silence, his modern, data-driven world completely upended. The stump of his certainty didn't just move. It had been ripped out of the ground and tossed aside. 2 days passed. The chugging of the caterpillar was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the country. On the third morning, a clean white pickup truck, the same one Richard Sterling drove, pulled slowly up the newly carved path to Silas Blackwood's farm. It stopped in the yard, and Sterling got out. He didn't look like a project manager anymore. He had taken off his logoed polo shirt and was wearing a simple work shirt. He walked up to the porch where Silas was sitting, cleaning a piece of equipment. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at Silas's hands, then at the peaceful, quiet farmstead. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and stripped of its usual authority. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, "I came here to apologize." He paused, as if the words were foreign to him. "I was arrogant, I was disrespectful, and I was wrong." He gestured back down the path. "My engineers, my surveyors, my entire team, we all said that was impossible. We had charts and geological surveys that proved it. I watched you do it, but I still don't understand how." Silas stopped his work and looked up at the younger man. He saw not a corporate suit, but a man genuinely humbled and confused. He decided to give him the lesson. "There's nothing to understand that your instruments can measure," Silas said calmly. "That old machine, she wasn't built for what you think of as work. Your machines are built for speed, for moving lots of dirt quickly. They have high horsepower. The old girl was built for pulling. She has torque. It's a different philosophy. She was designed to apply steady, patient force endlessly. She doesn't have limiters that tell her to quit when things get hard. She'll just keep pulling, slower and slower, right down to her last revolution. It's not about overwhelming the obstacle with brute power in one go. It's about leaning into it with a force that never, ever gives up. Patience is a kind of power, Mr. Sterling." He continued, "And the path. My father found that path because he walked the land for a year before he ever put a plow to it. He learned its secrets. He knew where the rock shelf was, where the water ran in the spring. He didn't fight the land. He asked it for a way through. Your survey maps are just lines on paper. They don't show you the history. They don't show you the soul of a place. You tried to force your grid onto a place that wasn't a grid." Sterling absorbed this in silence. The lesson was so simple, so fundamental, that it felt profound. He had spent his entire career trying to conquer problems, to defeat them with overwhelming resources. He had never once considered persuading them. "What do I owe you?" he asked finally. "For the damage, for the trouble we caused." Silas shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. The land is yours. You had the legal right, but access is about being a neighbor." He thought for a moment. "If you really want to make it right, don't give me a dime. Talk to your company. You have resources. That new path is rough. It could be a proper road, a donation to the County Road Commission. Enough to have it properly graded and graveled would make it a safe, all-weather access road. Not just for me, but for the fire department, for anyone who needs to get to this part of the valley. Turn a fence that divides into a road that connects. The story of Silas's Road, as it came to be known, spread through the county like wildfire in a dry field. It was told in the feed store, at the diner, and over backyard fences. It became a local legend, a modern tall tale with a rusty yellow hero. Richard Sterling, to his credit, did more than Silas asked. AgriCorp not only paid to have the new road professionally built, they dedicated it as a public thoroughfare and named it Blackwood Way. Sterling himself was changed by the experience. He was still an ambitious man, but a new layer of wisdom coated his sharp edges. He learned to listen, to walk the land before he planned it, and to respect the quiet knowledge of the people who had lived there for generations. In his big corporate office, amidst the charts and financial projections, he kept a small framed photograph on his desk. It was a picture of the Caterpillar 22, sitting silent and proud in the sunlight. It was his reminder that newer is not always better, and that true power doesn't always roar. 20 years later, Richard Sterling was retired. His son, a bright young man named David, was now a project manager at AgriCorp, following in his father's footsteps. David was overseeing a new corporate farm development in a neighboring state when they hit a catastrophic problem. They were trying to install a series of drainage culverts in a boggy, clay-filled valley, and their modern $600,000 tracked excavators kept getting hopelessly mired in the suction-like mud. After 2 weeks and 3 stuck machines, the project was at a standstill, costing the company tens of thousands of dollars a day. David called his father in desperation, explaining the situation. Richard listened patiently on the other end of the line. When his son was finished venting his frustration, the old man chuckled softly. "Son," he said, "let me tell you a story about a man named Silas Blackwood and his old Caterpillar tractor." He recounted the legend of Blackwood Way in detail. When he was done, he said, "Old Silas passed on a few years back, but I hear his grandson, young Tom, still runs the farm, and I hear he keeps the old girl in the barn just like his granddad did. You've tried the modern way, and it failed. Maybe it's time you tried asking for help from someone who understands the old ways." A week later, a flatbed truck arrived at the mired AgriCorp project. On its back was the 1934 Caterpillar 22, looking every bit its age, but clean and ready. Tom Blackwood, a man with his grandfather's quiet eyes and capable hands, climbed down from the cab. David Sterling, holding his father's story in his mind, walked up and extended a hand, not with the arrogance of a boss, but with the humility of a student. The engineers and the operators laughed, just as their predecessors had 2 decades before, but the laughter died as Tom Blackwood and the old girl went to work, patiently, relentlessly, and successfully pulling the massive modern machines from the mud that had held them captive. The story had come full circle. The lesson had been passed down. The engineers had laughed, but the old Caterpillar had answered, and the way was cleared. That's what happens when you underestimate something that was built not for a price, but for a purpose, not for a season, but for a century.